It was just another rainy evening in Seattle. The kind of night where the city felt swallowed by the dark, damp air, and the streets were practically empty except for the occasional echo of footsteps splashing through puddles. The usual mist had settled over the skyline, hanging thickly in the air like a veil that refused to lift. It seemed as though the rain had washed the city clean, but underneath it all, something felt off. The air was heavier tonight, as if the very atmosphere was thick with secrets. Seattle was known for its gloom, but there was a distinct heaviness now, something almost tangible, a feeling that made every person walking down the street just a little bit more cautious. As the night wore on, the rain turned from a steady drizzle to a sharp, relentless downpour, hammering against windows and streets alike. Cars crawled through the streets, their headlights carving through the fog, leaving a trail of reflection on the wet asphalt. Yet, the city was unnaturally quiet. No one was out for a late stroll, and even the usual noise from the bars and restaurants seemed muffled, as if the entire city had decided to close its eyes for the night. But beneath the silence, a low hum of rumors began to stir. Whispers that swirled in the dark corners of bars and across quiet living rooms. It was the legend of the Butcher of Seattle. The name alone sent a shiver down the spine. People had started talking about him again, a man whose presence in the city was more myth than reality, but the fear he inspired was very real. The legend went something like this. On stormy nights like tonight, when the rain came pouring down and the streets were empty, the butcher would crawl from the shadows, eyes glinting with malice, searching for his next victim. He was always said to be watching, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out cap or behind the darkness of an alleyway. The story was always the same. He was a shadow, someone who blended into the mist of the city and struck when the time was right. They said he wasn't just a man. He was a force, a predator lurking in the corners of Seattle, taking people without a trace, leaving only bloodstains behind as a sign of his presence. The victims were never found. No bodies, no answers, just the stain of fear that lingered long after the blood had dried. The first time the story surfaced, it was in a conversation between two locals in a coffee shop, whispered just loudly enough to catch the attention of anyone sitting close enough. The older man, a regular, was sharing a story of his youth, telling the younger crowd about a time when the streets of Seattle were darker and more dangerous than they were now. People used to vanish, he'd said, eyes darting around the room, ensuring no one was eavesdropping. It's not just an old tale. The butcher was real. He's out there still. The younger crowd didn't take him seriously, chalking it up to another tall tale, a dark legend created by the city's gloomy atmosphere. But there was something in the way the man said it, the tightness in his voice that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, strange disappearances, unsolved mysteries, and a growing sense of unease that seemed to wrap itself around the city like a vice. They said that the butcher always came on stormy nights, on nights like this one, when the fog thickened and the streets emptied. His victims weren't chosen for any particular reason. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The legend became a part of Seattle's DNA, woven into the fabric of its history, passed down from generation to generation. It was the story that parents told their children to keep them inside on stormy nights, the warning that echoed through the dark, deserted streets. The butcher was out there, and he was waiting. The strange thing about the butcher of Seattle was that no one could remember the last time he'd actually been seen. No one could pinpoint when the last victim disappeared. Yet, the legend persisted. People still feared him, still talked about him, even though there were no concrete facts to back up the stories. There were only rumors, bloodstains, and the eerie feeling that would hang in the air whenever the rain started to fall. For some, the legend was simply a way to explain the things they couldn't understand. The strange disappearances that happened over the years, cases that were never solved, people who were never found. Were these just coincidences? Or was there something darker at work? No one could say for sure. Some dismissed it as nothing more than a myth, a story told to keep people inside, to scare them into being cautious. Others, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the butcher was real, that he was out there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment. The unsettling truth was that there were no answers, no clear explanation, just a city that was slowly growing more afraid of the dark. And the worst part, no one knew if the butcher was a man or something more sinister. Was he an urban legend brought to life? Or was he just a dark force that had always been there, feeding off the fear of the people? The questions were endless, and the only thing that remained was the fear. The lingering sense of dread that crept into the hearts of everyone who lived in Seattle. On nights like this, when the rain fell so hard you could barely hear anything over the pounding of the water, people would lock their doors and stay inside, clutching their loved ones just a little bit tighter. And while most people would dismiss it as nothing more than a story, others couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at work, that the butcher was still out there, waiting for his next victim. As the night wore on, the whispers grew quieter, swallowed by the sound of the rain. But in the distance, something was stirring. Something in the shadows. Something that made the night feel just a little bit colder, just a little bit darker. And though no one could say for sure what it was, the legend of the Butcher of Seattle would never truly fade away, not as long as the rain kept falling and the streets remained empty. The question remained, unanswered and unsettling. Was the Butcher of Seattle real? Or was it just another story, told to keep the darkness at bay? No one knew, but everyone feared what might happen if the truth was ever uncovered. It all began several years ago in the heart of Seattle when a young woman named Emily disappeared without a single trace. She wasn't someone who would just vanish. She was well known in her neighborhood, a familiar face at the local bar, and someone who always made it home at the end of the night. But that particular evening, something was different. It was a Thursday, and like many others, Emily had spent her evening at the corner pub on 3rd Avenue. The air outside was thick with the typical Seattle drizzle, the kind of rain that soaked you through without warning, and the streets shimmered under the streetlights, reflecting the amber glow of the city's neon signs. She had said goodbye to her friends around midnight, slipping into her jacket and stepping out into the cold, wet night. It was the kind of evening where the rain dripped steadily from the edges of the awnings, and the sound of distant traffic echoed in the streets. The walk home was only a few blocks, but Emily had always taken her time, enjoying the solitude of the rain-soaked city, lost in her thoughts. That night, she walked slowly, her boots splashing softly in the puddles as she made her way down the dimly lit streets. The rhythmic tapping of her heels against the wet pavement was the only sound that could be heard in the silence of the night, except for the occasional honk of a passing car or the whoosh of tires against wet asphalt. She was last seen by a neighbor, an older man who was taking out his trash. He'd waved to her as she passed by, just as he had done countless times before. "Have a good night, Emily," he called out, and she waved back, her smile bright under the streetlights. It wasn't an unusual interaction. She was just another Seattleite on a rainy evening, heading home after a long day. But that was the last time anyone saw her. And next morning, Emily's roommates were concerned when she hadn't returned by the time they woke up. It wasn't like her to not come home after a night out, especially when they'd made plans to meet up later. They tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in as the day stretched on, and there was still no word from her. They contacted the police, and soon a search was launched to find the missing woman. Flyers were posted all around the city with her smiling face and a brief description of her last known whereabouts. The city, usually indifferent to the passing of time, was now suddenly on edge. Something didn't feel right. Days passed, and the search for Emily grew more desperate. The police combed through her apartment, speaking to her friends and family, trying to piece together her last movements. They discovered nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of struggle, no clues that suggested anything other than a young woman simply walking home on a rainy night. There was no hint that anything sinister had occurred. Still, the fact that Emily had simply disappeared without a trace weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Her friends, who had always known her to be cautious and aware of her surroundings, couldn't understand how someone could just vanish into thin air. It wasn't until a few days later, when the police received an anonymous tip, that the first real piece of evidence surfaced. The tip led them to the docks on the waterfront, a quiet part of the city where the rain often masked the sounds of anything unusual. There, hidden behind a stack of crates, they found Emily's purse. The leather was wet, and the contents were scattered about. Her wallet, a few crumpled bills, her ID, and a phone that had been left open, the screen still glowing faintly in the darkness. It was strange. Why would she have left her purse behind? Why would she be so careless, especially on a night when it was so cold and wet? The purse was the only clue they had, and it wasn't much to go on. There were no signs of a struggle around the area. No footprints in the mud, no fingerprints left behind. Emily was gone, and nothing about the scene made sense. The police lodged an investigation, questioning anyone who might have seen something, anything, that could help them understand what happened. But no one had seen anything. The streets were quiet, as they always were on rainy nights. No one had heard any screams. No one had heard any cries for help. The police were stumped, and as the days turned into weeks, Emily's case grew colder. It was as if she had simply evaporated, vanished into thin air, swallowed by the city's thick fog and darkness. Some people began to speculate. Was it a random act of violence? Could she have been the victim of a robbery gone wrong? But nothing about the situation added up. There was no robbery, no signs of forced entry or a struggle. The purse, left behind at the docks, seemed more like an offering, something placed with intent. Some whispered it could have been the work of a serial killer, someone who had been operating in the shadows of Seattle for years, picking off victims one by one. But then, others started to talk. Slowly, over time, the rumors grew, and the story began to change. People began to connect Emily's disappearance with the long-standing urban legend of the Butcher of Seattle. Was it possible that the Butcher had claimed another victim? Could the legend be true after all? People who had never believed in the stories of the past started to reconsider. What if the Butcher wasn't just a myth? What if he was real and he was out there, lurking in the darkness, picking off those who wandered too far from safety? The rumors spread like wildfire. People said the Butcher took his victims, dragging them into the shadows of the city, where no one could hear their screams. Some even claimed to have seen strange figures lurking in the alleys on the very nights when Emily had disappeared. Figures that blended seamlessly into the dark streets, too quick to identify, but leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. But despite all the speculation, no one had any concrete answers. The police couldn't find a single shred of evidence that pointed to a suspect. And the case began to grow cold. Just another unsolved mystery in a city that had seen its share of them. Emily's family never gave up hope. They continued to search for answers, to keep her memory alive. But as the years passed, the details surrounding her disappearance faded into the background, overtaken by the passing of time and the countless other mysteries the city had to offer. Yet for some, the mystery of Emily's disappearance lingered in their minds. Was she just another random victim, or was there something darker at play? Could the Butcher have been responsible for her disappearance, just as he had been responsible for so many others? Or was the truth even more chilling than anyone could have imagined? The unanswered questions hung in the air, just like the ever-present fog of Seattle, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. After Emily's disappearance, things in Seattle started to take a strange turn. The city, which had always been known for its rain and misty nights, now seemed to carry an air of dread. People began reporting strange sightings, figures standing in windows at night, peering out from behind curtains, watching the streets with cold, emotionless eyes. These figures weren't always the same. Sometimes they were seen in dark alleys, other times in abandoned buildings, hidden in the shadows. Only their silhouettes visible against the dim light from the street lamps outside. No one knew who they were or what they wanted, but there was one thing that everyone who saw them agreed on. The presence of these figures was unsettling, and it sent a chill down their spine. It started as nothing more than rumors. Whispers exchanged between neighbors, spoken in hushed voices in cafes or over the phone. Did you hear about the guy who saw someone watching him from the window last night? Or, I swear, I saw a figure standing in that old building on 5th Avenue, just staring out at the street. At first, these stories were dismissed as nothing more than overactive imaginations. After all, Seattle had always had its fair share of strange occurrences, especially on stormy nights, when the city seemed to take on an eerie, almost otherworldly feel. But as the reports grew more frequent, something shifted in the atmosphere. There was a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edges of the city's consciousness, waiting to be acknowledged. It wasn't long before the sightings became more specific. People began to notice that the figures seemed to appear more often in places that were abandoned, run down, or forgotten by the rest of the city. Old warehouses, derelict buildings, and empty apartments. These were the places where the figures were most commonly spotted. Some people claimed to have seen them at the same time each night, their dark forms appearing behind the curtains, just as the clock struck midnight. The fact that they appeared only at night, when the streets were empty and the city was quiet, made the sightings even more unsettling. And despite the growing number of reports, no one could figure out who or what these figures were. But there was one person who wasn't content with simply hearing about these strange occurrences from others. Chris was a young man in his mid-20s, an adventurous soul who had always been drawn to the mysteries of the city. He had heard the rumors, of course, and at first he had dismissed them like everyone else. But as the reports continued to pour in, a sense of curiosity began to gnaw at him. He couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to these sightings, something that no one had yet uncovered. There was something in the way people described the figures, something that felt off, something that made them sound like they weren't just human, but something else entirely. That something had sparked Chris's interest, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, after hearing about yet another sighting in an old, abandoned apartment building on the edge of town, Chris decided to investigate for himself. The building had been empty for years, its windows boarded up and its doors locked, but that didn't stop the rumors from spreading. People claimed they'd seen the figure in one of the upstairs windows, staring out at the street below. The thought of a mysterious figure hiding in the darkness of that building was enough to draw Chris in. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and his curiosity, he set out to uncover the truth. As he made his way through the rain-soaked streets, the city seemed unusually quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of Seattle was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The only sound that could be heard was the soft tap of his footsteps on the wet pavement. The air was thick with fog, and the streetlights cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the road. When Chris arrived at the apartment building, he stood in front of it for a moment, staring up at the dark windows. The building was old and decrepit, its exterior covered in grime and peeling paint. It looked like the kind of place that hadn't seen life in decades. The building's front door was locked, but Chris had heard about a back entrance that was usually left open. He made his way around the side of the building, and sure enough, the back door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to slip inside. The air inside was musty, and the floor creaked under his weight as he made his way up the stairs. The building was pitch black, the only light coming from his flashlight, which flickered slightly as he moved through the dusty hallways. He tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching him, something just beyond the edge of his sight. But the farther he ventured into the building, the more that feeling grew, until it was almost suffocating. When he reached the second floor, he stopped. He could hear something, the faint sound of movement, like a creaking floorboard or the soft shuffle of footsteps. His heart began to race, but he pushed the fear aside. He wasn't going to back down now. He followed the sound, creeping quietly down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. At the end of the hall, there was a window. The curtains were drawn, but there was a gap in the fabric, just wide enough for someone or something to peer through. Chris approached the window slowly, his breath caught in his throat. He could see a shadow moving behind the curtain, the faint outline of a figure standing just out of view. He took a deep breath and pushed the curtain aside, just enough to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing in the darkness of the room was a tall, menacing figure. The shape was vaguely human, but there was something wrong about it. The figure was too tall, its proportions all wrong, like a person stretched out to an unnatural height. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but Chris could see a glint of something in its hand, a long, sharp object gleaming faintly in the dim light. He couldn't see the figure's eyes, but he could feel them, cold and piercing, as though they were staring directly at him. His breath hitched in his throat, and for a moment, he froze. Then the figure shifted. It turned its head slowly, almost deliberately, and Chris's heart stopped. He could feel its gaze on him, even though he couldn't see its eyes. It was like the figure knew he was there, that he had seen it. Panic surged through him, and without thinking, he turned and ran. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty halls, and for a moment, he could have sworn he heard something following him. Chris made it back to the front door, his pulse racing, his body trembling with fear. He didn't look back as he stepped into the rain-soaked streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop running until he was far away from the building, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. But as he glanced over his shoulder one last time, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Standing in one of the windows of the apartment building was the figure, watching him, its cold eyes locked on his retreating form. That was the last time anyone saw Chris. He was never heard from again. His disappearance was just as mysterious as Emily's, and despite a thorough search, no trace of him was ever found. Some say the butcher took him, just as he had taken Emily. Others whisper that the figure in the window wasn't just a person at all. It was something far darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows of Seattle for years. Whatever the truth was, Chris was gone, and his disappearance only added to the growing sense of terror that had begun to consume the city. Months passed, and with each one, the city of Seattle grew more restless. The air was thick with a sense of unease, a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the streets like the never-ending rain. People spoke in hushed tones, afraid to acknowledge the dark whispers that were spreading like wildfire. The disappearances of Emily and Chris, combined with the mysterious sightings and the strange figures in the windows, had left the entire city on edge. The police were no closer to solving the mystery. No clues, no evidence, no suspects. All they had were vague rumors and a growing sense of dread. As the months wore on, more people disappeared. Some familiar faces, others strangers who had only briefly passed through the city. Each disappearance seemed to echo the same pattern, leaving behind nothing but confusion and fear. The media picked up on the story, turning it into a local sensation. People began to refer to the mysterious figure lurking in the shadows as the Butcher of Seattle, and rumors about his identity swirled like a storm, feeding the panic that was consuming the city. Was he a serial killer? A ghost? A supernatural entity that fed on the fear of the city's residents? No one knew for sure, but the more the rumor spread, the more terrifying the idea seemed. One night, as the city lay in an uneasy sleep, a local reporter named Sarah received an anonymous tip. It came by phone, with a voice barely above a whisper. The caller told her about an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that had long been abandoned. The caller claimed that this was where the butcher had hidden, where he had been carrying out his dark deeds for years. It was the first real lead anyone had gotten in months, and Sarah, ever the curious journalist, couldn't resist the temptation. She knew this could be her big break, the chance to uncover the truth about the butcher once and for all. But there was a gnawing feeling in her gut, a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Still, she pushed it aside and grabbed her camera. She was determined to get to the bottom of it. A warehouse was located on the outskirts of Seattle, in an industrial area that had seen better days. The buildings around it were decaying, their windows boarded up, and the streets were eerily quiet. The wind howled through the empty streets, and the rain fell harder as Sarah parked her car outside the warehouse. She sat in the car for a moment, staring at the large, dark structure in front of her. The building was old, its brick exterior cracked and weathered. There were no signs of life, no lights, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there for years. It felt like the kind of place where the past lingered in the shadows, where forgotten secrets were buried under layers of dust and decay. And in that moment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her flashlight and camera, locked the car door, and walked toward the entrance. The warehouse doors were rusted, their hinges groaning as she pushed them open. The sound echoed through the empty space, sending a shiver down her spine. As she stepped inside, the musty scent of damp wood and old metal hit her, and she shuddered. The warehouse was a maze of broken shelves, old crates, and discarded equipment. The floors creaked beneath her feet, and the sound of dripping water filled the silence. Sarah's heart raced as she moved deeper into the building, her flashlight flickering as she searched for any sign of the butcher's presence. The further she ventured into the warehouse, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay seemed to cling to everything. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, and she felt a strange unease creeping over her. She had been in abandoned buildings before, but this felt different. There was something wrong about this place, something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the feeling that something was hiding in the shadows, something that was waiting for her to get too close. As Sarah moved through the building, she came across a narrow staircase that led down to the basement. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity pushed her forward. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. The basement was dark, the air heavy and damp, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, her heart pounding in her chest. The basement was filled with old furniture, crates, and piles of discarded junk. But it was what she found in the far corner that stopped her in her tracks. There, in the corner of the basement, was a small room. It was barely visible in the dim light, hidden behind a stack of old crates. But when Sarah saw it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over her. She stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the room. The walls were covered in old, faded photographs. At first, Sarah thought they were just random images, old black and white photos of families, some of them long forgotten. But as she moved closer, her eyes widened in horror. The faces in the photographs were all too familiar. They were the faces of the missing people, Emily, Chris, and several others who had disappeared over the past year. Their expressions were vacant, lifeless, their eyes staring out of the photographs, as if they had been trapped in time. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the rest of the room. In the center, there was a table, its surface covered in what looked like old bloodstains. The smell in the room was pungent, a mix of decay and something darker. As Sarah stepped closer to the table, her flashlight flickered again, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. There, etched into the wall behind the table, was a strange symbol. It was crude, the lines jagged and uneven. But it was unmistakable, a twisted, horrifying mark that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Sarah took a step back, her heart racing, as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The room felt suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on her. She was about to turn and leave when suddenly the lights flickered once more. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, Sarah felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands trembling, and when the light flickered back to life, she froze. There, standing in the doorway of the small room, was a figure. It was tall, its features hidden by the shadows, but Sarah could make out the shape of its body, a large, menacing figure looming in the doorway. The figure stepped forward, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that she was not alone. The figure's face was obscured by the darkness, but she could see a twisted smile, wide and unnerving, stretching across its face. It was the butcher, or something that looked like him. Before she could react, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside the small room. Panic surged through Sarah as she rushed to the door, pulling at the handle with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness, getting closer. She could feel the figure closing in on her, and she knew she had to escape. With one final, desperate push, she managed to wrench the door open and stumble out into the darkness. She ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she scrambled up the stairs and into the main warehouse. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for breath, her mind racing with what she had just seen. Sarah barely escaped with her life, but what she found in the basement of that warehouse would haunt her forever. The photographs, the blood-stained table, the strange symbol carved into the wall. These were the clues that the butcher had left behind. And as she glanced over her shoulder one last time, she knew that whatever she had uncovered, it was only the beginning of something much darker. Now, everyone in Seattle was on edge. What had once been a quiet, fog-drenched city was now a place where fear permeated every street, every building, every home. People locked their doors tighter at night, even in neighborhoods that were considered safe. No one dared walk alone after dark, and if they could avoid it, they stayed far away from the dark corners of the city. The sense of unease was everywhere, the kind of anxiety that you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried. It wasn't just the rain that seemed to weigh heavily on the city now. It was the constant fear that something or someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The butcher, who had once been nothing more than an urban legend, was no longer a story told to scare children into staying inside. He was real, and he was out there. Sarah's findings had changed everything. When she discovered the photographs in the basement, the blood-stained table, and the strange symbol carved into the wall, the case had taken a horrifying turn. What she had uncovered was more than anyone had expected, more than anyone had dared to imagine. The police, who had once dismissed the idea of a serial killer or any connection between the disappearances, were now starting to reconsider everything. They had no answers, no suspects, and no way of explaining the strange events that had been unfolding for months. But now, even they couldn't ignore the facts that Sarah had presented. The truth was starting to take shape, and it was darker than anyone could have predicted. The city, once full of life and energy, now seemed like a shell of itself. People avoided the streets at night, the usual vibrant nightlife of Seattle dimming as the fear of the unknown took hold. The bars were quieter, the restaurants emptier, and even the normally bustling Pike Place market had lost some of its usual charm. It was as though the fear had seeped into the very foundation of the city. People could feel it in their bones, a deep, primal fear that they couldn't explain. And the more they talked about the butcher, the more they feared that he was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. In the days following Sarah's report, the number of strange disappearances grew. A man was last seen in Pike Place Market, a regular who had been shopping for fresh fish. He'd spoken to a vendor around 8:00 p.m. and then suddenly was gone. The police initially thought he had just left for the night, but when his wife reported him missing, they found no trace of him anywhere. His car was parked outside. His wallet and phone were still in his pocket. There was nothing to explain where he had gone or what had happened to him. The absence was unnerving, but not as unnerving as the next disappearance, which occurred just a few days later. A couple out for an evening walk with their dog along the waterfront was reported missing as well. Witnesses had seen them near the docks, strolling by the water, laughing and enjoying their evening. And then, just like the man at Pike Place, they were gone. No one had seen them leave. Their dog was found wandering the streets hours later, alone, whimpering in the rain. The couple's disappearance sent shockwaves through the city. It was as though they had simply vanished, swallowed by the night. The police, now fully aware that something sinister was happening, began to investigate the cases more closely. But there was no pattern, no connections between the missing people that they could discern. Some of the victims had been out walking alone. Others had been with family or friends. Some had been in busy public places. Others in quiet, isolated corners of the city. The disappearances seemed random, but the truth was far more disturbing. The more people talked about the butcher, the more reports of strange disappearances surfaced. It wasn't just the city's residents who were disappearing. Tourists, transients, and even those passing through the city were vanishing without a trace. It was as if Seattle itself had become a trap, a place where people came to visit or live and never left. Rumors spread quickly, growing more bizarre with each telling. Some claimed that the butcher was a ghost, a spirit that haunted the streets of Seattle. Others said he was a man who had lived in the city for decades, and now, for reasons unknown, he had become something far more terrifying. There were whispers that the butcher had once been a victim himself, a person who had been wronged by the city. And now he was seeking revenge, taking victims at random and leaving nothing but bloodstains behind. And then there were those who believed the butcher was something far more supernatural, something that fed off the fear of the people. Growing stronger, the more they talked about him. The fear itself seemed to give the butcher power, and the more terrified the city became, the more likely they were to fall victim to him. It wasn't just the disappearances that were troubling. There were other signs, subtle at first, that something was very wrong in the city. People began to report strange occurrences, footsteps behind them in the dark, flickering streetlights, and strange noises coming from the shadows. It was as though the city had become a living thing, constantly watching, constantly listening. And the most unsettling thing of all, it felt as if the people of Seattle were not just living in fear, they were feeding it. The more they talked about the butcher, the more they whispered about his next move, the more the city seemed to become consumed by the darkness. It was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fear was real, and the more they gave into it, the more it seemed to fuel whatever was out there in the shadows. And then, one night, the unimaginable happened. A group of college students, out for a late-night walk, ventured into an abandoned part of the city, a place known for its decaying buildings and overgrown streets. They were laughing, joking, not taking the threat seriously, when one of them noticed something strange in the distance. It was a shadow, moving quickly, darting between the buildings, almost too fast for the human eye to follow. The students, too intrigued to turn back, followed the shadow into the heart of the abandoned district. They were a few blocks in when they saw it. The figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in darkness, staring at them from a broken window. The students froze, their hearts racing. The figure was motionless, its eyes gleaming in the dark, watching them. But before they could react, the figure vanished, disappearing into the night. The students didn't know it, but that would be the last time anyone saw them alive. The next morning, the police found their bodies, disfigured, mutilated, discarded in a nearby alley. Their clothes were torn, their faces twisted in fear. The only clue was a symbol etched into the wall near their bodies, the same symbol that Sarah had discovered in the basement of the warehouse. The symbol was everywhere now, on the walls, on the pavement, carved into trees in the city's parks. It was as if the butcher was leaving a mark, a calling card, a signature for anyone who dared to look. The more people saw it, the more they understood. This wasn't just about the victims. It was about fear. The butcher didn't need to kill everyone. He didn't need to take everyone. He needed to make them fear. And that was exactly what he had done. The city was no longer just haunted by the memory of the butcher. It was consumed by him. The legend had come to life. The more people whispered his name, the more they feared him. the more powerful he became. Seattle was no longer a city of rain and mist. It was a city of terror, ruled by the butcher, who thrived on the fear of its residents. The streets that had once been full of life now lay empty at night, a reflection of the darkness that had settled over the city. And as the rumors spread and the disappearances continued, one thing was clear. The butcher was out there, and he was feeding off the fear of everyone who had ever heard his name. It had been months since the terror began. People had disappeared, others had been found mutilated, and the city of Seattle had transformed into a place where the shadows seemed to stretch longer and the night came alive with whispers. The police were no closer to solving the mystery. Each day, more reports came in. Strange sightings, eerie noises in the middle of the night, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The Butcher of Seattle, once dismissed as an urban legend, had become a living nightmare, feeding on the fear that gripped the city. The streets were empty after dark, and the sound of footsteps echoing in the night had become a rare, almost unnatural occurrence. No one dared to confront the butcher, not knowing if the stories about him were true. But one fateful night, that all changed. A group of brave souls, united by their fear and their determination to end the madness, decided that enough was enough. The city had lived in the grip of fear for far too long. They could no longer sit idly by while the butcher continued to haunt Seattle's darkest corners. They armed themselves with flashlights, cameras, and the kind of resolve that comes from the desperation to reclaim their city. The rumors of bloodstains on the streets, the whispers of strange figures seen in the shadows, they had all been building to this moment. This was their chance to confront the terror, to face the butcher head-on, and put an end to the nightmare that had taken hold of their home. The group consisted of 5 individuals. Sarah, the reporter who had uncovered so much of the truth about the butcher's killings. Chris's older brother, who had been searching for answers ever since his sibling vanished without a trace. 2 local residents, a man named Marcus and his wife, Jenny, both of whom had lived in Seattle for years and were terrified of what had become of their once vibrant city. And finally, a former police officer, Tom, who had been following the case closely, growing more and more convinced that there was a dark conspiracy hidden beneath the city's surface. Together, they formed an unlikely team, each with their own reasons for wanting to stop the butcher, but all sharing one common goal: to bring an end to the reign of terror that had left Seattle in the grip of darkness. Their plan was simple, if not reckless. They would trace the butcher's movements, follow the trail of bloodstains and cryptic symbols that had appeared all over the city. The hidden alleys, the forgotten corners, the abandoned buildings, they would search every inch. And wherever the trail led, they would confront the butcher. Armed with little more than flashlights, cameras, and an unshakable determination, they ventured into the deepest, darkest parts of Seattle. Places the city's residents had long avoided. The further they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with the sense of something lurking just out of sight, watching them with malevolent eyes. As they moved through the desolate streets, the group grew more tense, their steps growing quieter as they entered abandoned buildings. There were no signs of life, only the remnants of a city once full of activity, now decaying and forgotten. They could fear nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the occasional creak of old wood or metal as they explored. The shadows seemed to grow longer with each passing minute, and the further they went, the more they felt as though they were being followed. The darkness, once so familiar, now seemed to be closing in on them. Hours passed, and they followed the trail deeper into the heart of the city. Bloodstains on the pavement led them to a derelict warehouse, its windows shattered and its door hanging off its hinges. The air around it felt cold, as though the building had been abandoned for years. Yet something about it felt alive, as though it had a presence of its own. The group stood in front of the building for a moment, hesitation written on their faces. But Sarah, driven by the urgency of the situation, took a step forward, pushing open the broken door. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of old crates, rusted equipment, and decaying walls. The dim light from their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The air was musty and thick with the smell of decay. As they moved through the warehouse, they noticed something that sent chills down their spines. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the surfaces in what appeared to be blood. Some of the symbols were familiar. Some had been seen in the warehouse Sarah had investigated months ago, but others were new, twisted marks that none of them recognized. They followed the trail deeper into the building, their flashlights illuminating more of the disturbing symbols as they went. And then they found it. A door, half hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, leading down into the basement. It was dark, colder than the rest of the building, and the air felt suffocating, as though something waited below. The group exchanged nervous glances, but there was no turning back now. They descended into the darkness. The basement was unlike anything they had expected. It was a maze of narrow passages, old equipment, and abandoned machinery. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of something metallic hung in the air. Their footsteps echoed eerily in the silence as they moved deeper into the bowels of the building, until they came to a small, dimly lit room. The walls of the room were covered in more of the strange symbols, and in the center, there was a large wooden table, stained with what appeared to be blood. The table was surrounded by various tools, some old, some new, and there was an unmistakable feeling of death that lingered in the air. And then they saw him. The butcher was standing in the corner of the room, his back turned to them. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden behind a grotesque mask. In his hand, he held a long, gleaming knife, its blade catching the dim light in a way that made it seem almost alive. His presence was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on them. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats. There was no turning back now. The butcher had been waiting for them. Before they could react, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way. The floor cracked, splintering with a deafening roar, and the group fell, tumbling into the darkness below. They landed hard, the sound of their bodies hitting the cold, damp earth, echoing through the underground maze. For a moment, everything was disorienting. Flashlights spinning, the sound of their heartbeats in their ears, the smell of dust and decay filling their lungs. They tried to get up, but the walls seemed to close in on them. The maze they had fallen into was endless. Twisting tunnels, narrow passageways, and rooms that led to nowhere. Panic set in as they scrambled to find a way out, but it was clear that they were trapped. The butcher's laughter echoed through the dark corridors, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down their spines. The deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. The walls seemed to shift, the passages leading them in circles, until they no longer knew where they were or how to escape. In the distance, they could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, growing louder with each passing second. The butcher was coming for them. They knew it was only a matter of time before he found them. They had come to confront him, to end the nightmare, but now they were the ones who were hunted. The fear that had consumed the city for so long had now consumed them. The butcher was real, and they were his prey. As the footsteps drew closer, they realized that they would never escape. The city's darkest corners had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many others. They had ventured into the depths, seeking answers, seeking to stop the terror, but instead they had become part of the legend, a legend that would never die. The butcher's twisted smile, hidden behind his grotesque mask, was the last thing they saw before the darkness swallowed them whole. The next morning, the city woke to another day, but the group was never heard from again. The butcher remained a shadow, a figure of terror, lurking in the dark corners of Seattle. His legend had grown stronger, more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. And as long as the fear persisted, so too would the butcher, waiting, watching, feeding on the anxiety of a city too afraid to face the truth.